Welcome to this deep dive where we dig into some source material and pull out the interesting bits for you.
Yeah, today we're looking at something pretty fundamental. The link, or maybe the gap, between our attitudes, what we think, and our behavior, what we actually do.
We've got a great source here on this. It covers attitudes, behavior, and those related ideas, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination.
And it kicks off with a real curveball, doesn't it? This idea that our attitudes, well, they don't always predict what we'll do. You'd think they would.
Seems logical, right? If I don't like something, I avoid it. But the source highlights this study, LaPierre's from the 1930s. It's kind of wild.
Totally. He traveled across the U.S. with a Chinese couple, stopped at hotels, restaurants, hundreds of places.
And out of almost 250 establishments, how many refused service?
Just one.
Only one. But then,
Right.
here's a twist, right?
Exactly, because LaPierre later wrote to all those same places. He asked, would you serve a Chinese couple?
Yeah.
And 92% said no, they wouldn't.
Wow. So face-to-face, they served them. But on paper, the attitude was refusal. That's a massive disconnect.
Huge. And that's our mission for this deep dive, really. Using just this source material, let's try to unpack why that happens and explore how group biases, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination actually form.
And crucially, what the source says about maybe reducing them. Okay, let's get into it. That LaPierre study really shakes things up. It suggests other factors are at play between attitude and action. What does the source point to?
Well, it mentions things like attitude specificity, like a really general attitude, maybe a vague negative feeling about a group might not predict a very specific action, like how you treat this particular couple standing politely in front of you.
The general versus the specific situation. Makes sense.
Right. And also attitude accessibility, basically. How easily does that attitude even come to mind in a moment? If it's not right there, other things might guide your behavior instead.
It's complex. Okay, so moving beyond just individuals, the source then gets into how we see groups. Stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. They sound similar, but the source draws clear lines. How does it break them down?
So a stereotype, according to the source, is the belief part. Shared ideas about the traits of a group. The source uses gender stereotypes as an example. Traditional ideas about men being competent and women warm.
Like mental shortcuts or schemas.
Exactly. They help us process info quickly, but they can be really rigid and hard to change. We tend to notice things that fit the stereotype.
Okay, belief is stereotype, then prejudice.
Prejudice is the feeling, usually negative. It's an emotional reaction towards someone just because they belong to a group. The source mentions Allport's definition, an antipathy based upon a faulty and inflexible generalization. It's that gut feeling.
Belief, feeling. So discrimination must be the action.
Precisely. Discrimination is the actual behavior treating someone differently, unfairly, because of that prejudice. It's the acting out of the bias.
And the source notes this isn't always obvious, right? It can be subtle.
Yeah, it talks about disguised forms, like tokenism.
Tokenism.
Where someone might make a small symbolic gesture, like giving minor help to someone from a targeted group just to appear unbiased, but they avoid any real action that would actually change the status quo or inequality.
Performs fairness without actually being fair. Okay, so stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. Where do these biases even come from? Why do we categorize and react this way?
The source points to a couple of big drivers. One is competition for resources. This links to something called realistic conflict theory.
Okay.
Basically, when groups feel like they're competing for limited things, jobs, land, status, even prizes, in an experiment, it breeds hostility.
Like that robber's cave experiment they mentioned, where they turned two groups of boys into enemies just by making them compete?
Exactly that. Classic example. The competition directly fueled the prejudice and conflict. Another big source is just social categorization itself.
You mean just putting people into us and them boxes?
Pretty much, yeah. The source suggests that simply categorizing ourselves and others into groups, even totally arbitrary ones, makes us favor our own in-group. We start seeing us as better than them. Our identity gets tied up with the group.
That feels pretty ingrained. So the million-dollar question, does the source offer any hope? How can we reduce these biases?
It does offer some paths. One key idea is increased intergroup contact. The simple notion that if groups interact more, under the right conditions, it can break down stereotypes. You start seeing individuals, not just a faceless group member.
So just getting people together can help.
It's a major factor, yeah. And related to that is recategorization, finding a common social identity. Think back to Robbers Cave again.
How they fix the hostility.
Right. They didn't just stop the competition. They introduced a superordinate goal. something both groups needed and had to cooperate on, like fixing the camp's water supply. Suddenly, they weren't two competing groups anymore. They were one larger group working together. It created a bigger S.
Turning enemies into allies through a shared problem. That's powerful. The source also mentions something about conscious effort.
Yes, learning to consciously negate stereotypes, actively working to override those automatic biased thoughts when they pop up.
So we've covered quite a journey here, from that surprising gap between attitudes and actions in the 30s to the roots of bias and competition and simple categorization, and finally, ways to potentially reduce it through contact and shared goals, all straight from this source material.
Absolutely. These are really useful psychological concepts for understanding ourselves and the world around us.
And it leaves us and you with a pretty big thought to chew on based directly on what we've discussed from the source. If our biases can be so automatic and maybe feelings like prejudice change slowly, how much conscious, deliberate work, like that idea of learning to negate stereotypes, is really needed to push past those reactions and actually change discriminatory behavior? Something to think about.